Hey people, so got the HP ZBook 17 G6 and the newer G7. So spec-wise, on paper, they're very similar. I think this one is really the definition of making something thinner and lighter. It's about 10% lighter, and I think volumetrically it's about 30% smaller, so it's really significant. I think on the performance side, you wouldn't really expect to see much difference, and spec-wise, you still have the same rich array of options, so things like up to 128 gig of RAM, up to 8-core processor, Core RTX up to 5000. So now you also have the AMD option. Really promising laptop. I think it's if you're coming from a G6, probably very little reason to upgrade. G5 and G6 are very similar machines, whereas as you can see, G7 footprint-wise, it's something else. Okay, let's have a look inside. So if you can see all the way up here, there's quite a noticeable difference at the top, isn't there? As you can tell, the G6, you can't go any further back. On the G7, goes back fully. Not entirely sure what is going to be useful, but I guess this is quite a good option for some people. Because the bezel has got thinner and lighter, I think for this generation repair-wise, if you damage your screen, it's a lot more difficult to service. Whereas with this one, you just take off the bezel, replace the screen. With this one, I think the display assembly as a whole has to come up, so it's full disassembly and more cost out of warranty if you damage the screen. So that's something to be aware of. I mean, it's not to say this one has got down to the Dell XPS level of thin bezelness, but it's certainly a lot less conspicuous, especially at the top versus the old one. The old one, strangely, the privacy shutter I think is quite easy to use. With the webcam shutter, it's a little bit hard to use at first, but I suspect you probably wouldn't use it too much. Just be careful not to scratch it. When you're using the privacy shutter, it shows a slightly different color, so that way you can quite easily spot if the privacy shutter is on or off. So the keyboard, as you expect from a 17.3-inch workstation, is quite reasonable. The keyboard has a number pad on the inside, helpful. I think the change you'll notice is that the power button has been moved on the G7 to the actual physical key. It means that it's probably easier to swap just in case the power button breaks down the road, I suppose. But I think in the shorter run, you might accidentally, for instance, press a backspace and accidentally press a power button when you're doing that. Otherwise, it's quite a decent key size, so it's you always feel that there's plenty of space. What I'll probably say is some of the keys give you more distinctive crispy sound. Wish the arrows were a little bit bigger, but nothing we can really change on this generation. If we're being really picky, going from the G6 to the G7, I think the keyboard is still very decent. The travel has marginally reduced, so I think it used to be very crispy across the board. Now it's more crispy on certain keys that you expect the crispiness on. So it's probably in line with the expectation when you make a laptop this much thinner and lighter that the keyboard will shrink a little bit, but still very manageable. The older G6 has a slightly odd shape around the corner. Wasn't quite sure what it was used productively for. I think it's just a design. But I think this is a more predictable shape, probably means easier to design around it. So on the older model, the track point is about 5.3 centimeters. On the newer one, it's noticeably shorter, so it's gone down from about 5.3 down to, I'll probably say, 4.6. So it's closer. It's really good to still have these top click buttons because some of the competitors have got rid of that. So it's good to have. I think the trackpad size is quite generous. I think if you're using Workstation laptop, you'll probably be using a mouse most of the time. Curious to see if over time there will be more keyboard marks on the screen because they've obviously compressed the laptop. But I think you probably should be fine. Let's. I think there's another check, which is one-handed opening. I can see it moving, so maybe not the most convincing attempt at one-handed opening. So maybe no. On this machine, you'll notice that the lid has a specific ridge. So it's a similar design language to the new EliteBook. So when HP refresh their machines, it's almost like a wholesale refresh. The one-handed opening is much more convincing on this model, but then you can occasionally see the machine still popping upwards, so two hands probably safer. Directly, if we place one machine on top of the other one, you can see just how much space is saved. I think it's probably a little bit longer on the front, probably 1.5 centimeters, and at least 1.3 centimeters on this side. So they've managed to shave off quite noticeable amount of weight, and equally the height of the laptop. I mean, this is insane. I'm not saying the new G7 is compact by any stretch of imagination, but it's just a lot more reasonable for a laptop, and if you deploy it for, let's say, a senior manager or something like that, they'll be a lot less likely to get annoyed for you because you've given them a really heavy laptop that they don't want to carry. So that's something else. The old one, yeah, I think is for the people who really accept that to get the power, you have to get the weight that goes along with it. I think the new one is just a value proposition to say, actually, no, you can make it a little bit thinner, a little bit lighter, still a hefty laptop, but more manageable. Okay, right, so let's take a look at the ports. So on this side, you still have the 3 USB Type A ports, which is quite nice. The lock slot and the Ethernet has switched places on the new model, as you can see here. The Ethernet is further back on this model, so that's potentially useful. The audio jack has been moved to this side as well, smart card reader as well. SD card still exists, it's on the other side, it's moved. Really good to see it still being here. I think some laptops are gradually getting rid of the SD card. On the right hand side, you'll notice that there's no more DVD drive on the new model. Instead, there's a SD card being moved to this position. It's what's helped this laptop to become more compact. Obviously, it's probably inevitable direction of travel. The other ports are very similar on this side. On the back of the machine, you can see more vents visible on the new model. It's not much ports availability on the back. I think that's one of the probably not criticism of the ZBook, but it's on some machines it's just really nice to have the ports all the way at the back. You just plug it into the things that you need to plug into. So the base display seems to be the same as the G6, so the Full HD 300 nits option. It seems like a decent option here. There are 3 550 nits options which are all 4K. Two of them look really similar. One of them is a touch screen. Of the two 4K non-touch panels, the Dream Color version tends to be the one where you can use the HP's internal calibration app. I think usually HP selects better panels and lets you use their app if you get the Dream Color version. But I think the standard 4K, if you can see it, it should still be very reasonable. The touchscreen option is noticeably brighter before and also seems to have wider coverage in terms of color. If you're used to the Adobe RGB coverage, one thing to notice is that the G6 used to have the 10-bit panel. Even though it was less bright at 400 nits, that panel could give you 100% coverage on the Adobe RGB, whereas on the newer G7, it seems that whilst it's doing 100% P3 coverage, it's probably likely to only give you maybe 70 to 80% Adobe RGB. So that's a slight drawback on this. Okay, so the material on the base suggests that this cover is actually quite thin. On the older one, it was distinctly more metallic. When you try to press into the older one, there's very little give. On the new one, it's less solid, but you don't get a feel that you're pressing into the battery, if that makes sense. So it's still okay, but I think to achieve the thinner and lighter weight, you do see the chassis having some more compact aspect to it. So on the base cover, you will see that it's quite easy to slide off, and if you put it back, it just goes 2 rubber feet on the base to get it lifted up a little bit. The rubber feet seems similar to before. There's a cutoff point here, probably to get more air on the bottom. And on the inside, it's quite a neat layout. The RTX and AMD model, I think, have the vapor chamber, if I remember correctly. So here's a battery, 2 RAMs of the 4 slots, and of course you've got one of the M2 here. As you can see, there's 2 slots here and here, so if you have a specific caddy, then there could be 2 M2 slots. Alternatively, if you prefer instead for there to be a 2.5 inch, then you can have the 2.5 plus the other slot. To get the keyboard open, it's required to access this next 2 RAM slots. But if you have 4 RAM slots, that can get you up to 120 GB of RAM. Really compact chassis, I think, and as you can see, the cooling vents at the back is more visible than last gen. We've got a 4G card. I think you just put the SIMs in here, if I'm not mistaken. And the Wi-Fi card seems to be quite easily changed here, which is nice. Don't have to get under the keyboard as you would on some models. This is a new charger. So physically it's smaller, as you can see. It's just over a centimeter shorter. Also on the other side, it's also a little bit more compact, which is quite nice. I think for me the difference is probably the more durable finish on the charger. I think that's going to be quite appreciated 2 or 3 years into usage. The speaker on the new G7 is marginally better than before. At a higher volume, it tends to crackle a little bit less. We were playing the soundtrack at the same part of the soundtrack at 100% volume. So as you can see, the G7 is a little bit louder as well. So it's an all-round nice improvement. There is a usual HP app which lets you set the audio settings. Noise cancellation could come in handy. It makes quite a noticeable difference to the sound quality, which is quite surprising. The speaker, it distorts a little bit less than the last gen, especially at the higher volume. The bass is there, it's not overpowering. The mid seems to be quite clear, and the highs is present. So even though it's slightly better than what I expected from Workstation laptop. One thing to say though is that the top cover, including palm rest, it will feel as if it's vibrating slightly when your speaker is on, especially at the higher volume. It might be that you prefer to switch on an external speaker instead, if you don't like your palm rest to be vibrating when it's typing, but it's not too noticeable. When we're heavily stressing both the CPU and GPU, the keyboard and the palm rest area remains sensibly temperatured. At the back of the laptop, it does get a little bit more hot, as you can see. But this is the really heavy stressing of both the CPU and the GPU. The base cover has certain hotspots, as you can see near the rear center. But where the fans are, they seem to be quite cool. Because the laptop has to put air from underneath the chassis, it's probably the best idea to use it on a desk. That way you don't overheat your lab, and at the same time the laptop can cool itself. What I'll say is that the noise of the laptop is quite sensibly managed when we're running the firmware. It's actually quite impressive. We've put the laptop into high performance mode and run the Cinebench. So firstly, you'll see this is a burst performance. It's quite sensible. It's 6-core processor, so it's not the 8-core more high-end option. And when we went from burst performance, which is 1 run pretty much, to a 10 minutes throttling, as you can see here, the score has reduced a little bit. It's still about 95% of the burst performance, which is quite impressive actually. And when we move from 10 minutes to the 30 minutes throttling, the performance further degrades down to about 92% of the burst performance. So 8% deficit over the 30 minutes. It's not as big as you might think. Keep in mind that this is a CPU-only workload, so expect the performance to degrade possibly more when you have GPU tasks running in the background at the same time. What we'll probably also say is that it really depends on the processor you get. If you go for the more high-end option, then perhaps you may get a little bit less than you might on the comparable units with more extensive cooling. Because keep in mind that this laptop has a 200 watts charger, whereas laptops, for instance, the ThinkPad P17,
they've got a more beefy 230 watts charger. I think either or, if you run CPU plus GPU at quite close to full load, you can get literally close to the 200 and saturated. So I think with the G7, it's sensible not to go over the top in terms of the spec. This panel is just under 290 nits, so it's reasonably close to the 300 advertised brightness. What we have in SRGB coverage is decent. The Adobe RGB color on this Full HD display, it could be a little bit higher for high-end workstation, but I guess the message here is if you want more coverage, you have to go with the 4K panel, which is reasonable.
And just for comparison, if we put it on top of our 15 G7, then yeah, it's really noticeable difference. And I think the 15, it has less powerful cooling in comparison to the 17, but you can still put very powerful hardware into it. Pretty much the same, it's just the TDP on the components are lower, so they wouldn't be able to go as fast. Okay, so we've got the HP ZBook 15 G6, so this is a 15.6 version of the predecessor. It's remarkable how thin it's got, so I think the only noticeable difference is this side. So just a frame of reference, if you're used to the 15 G6 or G5 even, the new 17 G7 is actually, it's not much more. Hardware-wise, surprising not too much performance gap. I think what we'll probably say is, I was trying to explain this yesterday of the difference between G6 and the G7. I think the explanation I can think of is the G6 gives you the solid workstation level performance. It's probably going to come at a marginally better price because it's on the market for a little bit longer. The G7, it's a more recent machine. It takes the same level of performance, but puts it into a more thin and light machine. It's not by any stretch of imagination thin and light in the Ultrabook sense, but it's just a little bit more manageable if you're giving this to a manager to lug around and they really don't want something heavy. So, if you really have to deploy something with lots of power and, they don't want anything too heavy, then I think that's the use case I can see of the G7 versus the G6. And obviously, as for performance, it's there's already no book check review. It's take a look at that. It's they usually go into quite some detail, so that's quite a helpful one. I think there seems to be some performance gap between the ZBook 15 G7 and the 17 G7, so the 17 is going to be faster. I think for me, really, when you compare them next to each other, I think it really says it all. It's just really different in the dimension. But when it's sitting on top of the older model, you can see it's not much difference in terms of the footprint. So the CPU has quite a generous power envelope. So that's 85 and 125 watts PR1, PR2 if you're on the performance mode. So that's quite generous. If we're being a little bit picky, then you'll remember that this charger is 200 watts for the RTX model or 150 watts for the standard T series graphics-based models. So it's, when you're stressing the CPU very heavily, it does eat into the available power envelopes. So for instance, Lenovo's machine typically has 230 watts instead of 200. Whereas Dell, sometimes they have the 240. They also have the 180, but I think most of the time you get the 240 if you go for higher specification. I mean, obviously with HP you can get 230 watts charger, get an adapter tip, but it's not standard, if that makes sense. So for me, what that means is if you're thinking of going for the max specification, then if it were me, I would just drop either RTX 5000 or I would drop something on the CPU side, so I don't have two of the top-end options, because you're going to struggle a little bit to work with the power envelope. But that's probably just me. But I mean, obviously on the Lenovo P17, if you have 30 extra watts, that really could come in a little bit handy. I think in terms of the other things, in terms of the general noise, I think the system seems to keep the noise to an acceptable level. I think on the RTX model you have the vapor chamber cooling, if I remember correctly. That's quite nice. So for me, the G7, it's quite a sensible machine. It's believe it or not, you can actually get this machine with the integrated graphics. Not really sure why, but apparently you can. So that's something. In terms of the timing, I think HP refreshes their workstation line most of the time once every year. So we're a coming up to the 8th gen refresh. I think for the Intel side of things, they're going to probably refresh the processor. But I mean, it's the same I've always said for the G6. So which is the longer laptop has been on the market, generally the more accessible the pricing, typically on the refurb market. So it's at the moment we're not seeing that many G7s in the refurb market, so that will over time improve. But I suspect when the G8 comes out, the price is going to be. Anyway, I think that's a different conversation. Anyway, I think that's all we have time for. If there's any question, just let us know in the comments. Hope that's helpful. Oh, and please like and subscribe. We're never quite sure if anybody watches our HP content, so it's very much appreciated if you do give it a like or subscribe.